The bow and arrow is among the oldest weapons continually used by man. Their design, of course, has changed somewhat, but the basic version might have been in use by humans for more than 50,000 years. Crossbows came later, but maybe not quite as late as you might think. Crossbows are a misunderstood weapon. They occupy kind of a strange place between traditional bows and firearms in the early modern period. And to the Western mind, they're most associated with battles with heavily armored knights in the Middle Ages, but they were actually invented more than 1,000 years before that. That's history that deserves to be remembered. The first evidence of the invention of the crossbow comes from China during the spring and autumn period, roughly 771 to 476 BC, with early archaeological examples dating to the 7th century BC. However, the crossbow locks in the period were made of bronze, and because locks could also have been made of bone or wood, the weapon might have emerged even earlier. It's also possible that the crossbow did not actually originate with the Chinese, but that they brought it technical sophistication. Joseph Needham in Science and Civilization in China mentions that versions of the crossbow were used by Asian peoples both north and south of the Chinese, and that the exact order of events is uncertain. The basic design was essentially a regular bow set horizontally across a stock, with a lock in the rear where the string could be pulled back to the catch. Part of the lock would also include a trigger for firing the weapon. Many of the early Chinese bows clearly were hand bows attached to a stock, allowing even inexperienced peasant soldiers to achieve relatively heavy draw weights with simple mass-produced bronze locks. They also had the advantages of holding the bow drawn indefinitely and allowing better accuracy. These may have used spherical pellets as ammunition rather than bolts or arrows. A Western Han mathematician compared the moon to the shape of a crossbow bullet. Written mentions come slightly later, and Sun Tzu's Art of War mentions crossbows several times, including in Chapter 6, when he says, "Energy may be likened to the bending of a crossbow, decision to the release of a trigger." Its invention was important to Chinese supremacy. According to an 11th century text, the crossbow is the strongest weapon of China, and what the 4 kinds of barbarians most fear and obey. This included both small hand versions, which Needham says outranged the bows of nomadic horse archers, and the much larger catapult forms used as siege weapons. The crossbow was one of the primary ranged weapons of Chinese armies. The records of the Grand Historian describe the Second Qin Emperor moving crossbow regiments numbering 50,000 men, and the early Han dynasty had arsenals containing several 100,000 crossbows. Needham argues that the crossbow was the standard weapon of the Han armies. But the Han was also the weapon's peak in China as weapons of war. It fell out of favor afterwards, although it never disappeared. A 7th century Tang dynasty writer said that a typical expeditionary army of 20,000 men would have 2,000 crossbowmen and slightly more bowmen. They also invented a repeating crossbow, a mechanism where pumping a lever forward and backward automatically draws the bowstring, drops a bolt into place, and fires the weapon in one continuous motion, although it was called a home protection crossbow and was not generally considered a military weapon. Part of their power came from the fact that the weapon was difficult to draw. Even early Chinese versions often had the men use their legs to pull the string back, resulting in a much greater force than could be achieved by hands alone. The most powerful later European crossbows were loaded with the aid of a stirrup, gaffle, screw, or windlass to pull back the string. In Europe, crossbow-like weapons seem to have emerged around the 5th century BC, based on a description by Heron of Alexandria in the 1st century. Heron calls the weapon the gastrophetes, or belly bow, so named for the curved end that would be pressed against an archer's belly as they reloaded, and describes it as a predecessor of the arrow-firing catapult. The Greeks already had some negative thoughts on archers. In one of Euripides' plays, a character denigrates Heracles by saying that he used a bow, a coward's weapon, and Heracles' father then defends the bow as a useful weapon. While ballista fire arrows, they are not properly crossbows, as they use torsion power and not tension power. It's not clear exactly how common crossbows were in Roman armies. The only description comes from Vetitius's De Re Militaris, and he declines to describe them as they are so well known, according to Needham. They included artillery-like weapons and arqueballista, which were described as fighting with bowmen on siege towers. Several Roman-era reliefs from modern France show what such a weapon looked like. Arrian's Ars Tactica, written in the 2nd century, mentions missiles shot not from a bow but from a machine on horseback, likely referring to a crossbow. The modern concept of a crossbow comes primarily from the medieval European versions. The crossbow was rare or non-existent in Europe between the fall of Rome and the year 1000, although some depictions appear on Pictish stones in that era. They are then mentioned again in the 10th century by Richelieu of Reims in the History of France. Crossbows were apparently used at the sieges of Senlis in 947 and of Verdun in 984. Crossbows may have been used at the Battle of Hastings. A contemporary poet mentions them, but they aren't depicted anywhere on the Bayeux Tapestry. The Domesday Book mentions an Odo the crossbowman as a tenant in Yorkshire. In England, the land best known for its longbows, crossbows played some important historical roles. In 1100, King William II was killed by a crossbow while hunting, probably by one of his own men. His son, King Henry I, was nearly killed during fighting with his daughter Julianne, who at one point asked her father to parley and then attempted to kill him with a crossbow. King Richard the Lionheart was killed by a crossbow bolt wound that turned gangrenous. All of those English kings made use of the weapon in their armies. But the weapon didn't have a good reputation. One contemporary chronicler writes, "Thus perished by the crossbow," which the English account dishonorable, King Richard, who first introduced the crossbow into France. The crossbow received numerous other knocks against it. Anna Komnena, Byzantine daughter of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, in the 1148 Alexiad, wrote that the crossbow is a bow of the barbarians, quite unknown to the Greeks, and that it was so powerful that it cut through shields and has been known to pierce a bronze statue. Such then is this monster of a crossbow, a very devilish invention, and the wretched man who is struck by it dies without feeling anything, not even feeling the blow. Crossbows were not generally capable of regularly piercing heavy armor of European soldiers until their later years, but they remained extremely dangerous. More than a decade earlier, Pope Innocent II prohibited, under anathema, the murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians and Catholics from now on. Anathema was a more serious kind of excommunication, excluding someone not only from the sacraments, but from Christian society altogether, usually because of heresy. Some historians suggest that rather than banning archery in general, the canon may have been speaking specifically of a tournament or wager involving arrows. The crossbow presented an interesting problem to medieval armies, especially in the High Middle Ages. As A.T. Hutto notes, one of the prevailing theories is that the weapon was specifically a threat to knights. The military aristocracy of Middle Age Europe in the 12th and 13th century was based on the heavily armored cavalry knight, where melee weapons and the charge were paramount. In that period, the noble was generally not expected to die in combat. It was much more valuable captured and ransomed. In those days, Hatto says, mail and shield offered very fair protection against lance and arrows. Hatto argues that this is clear from textual descriptions that lionize the chivalry of knightly warfare, done on horseback, in heavy armor, and with lance and sword. Archery has always presented a risk to this style of fighting. Procopius in the 6th century noted the effectiveness of horse archery against the Ostrogoths, but despite that noted that not a man among the Ostrogoths is practiced in horse archery, often at great cost in battle. Hatto notes that even at the knight's height, reverses at the hands of Saracens, burghers, and royal mercenaries and levies were aided by their use of archery. When they did add archers to their armies, Europeans delegated the weapon to lower classes, although they were paid well and generally considered among the elite units of non-knights. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council specifically barred clerics from professions that shed blood. The canon specifically bans being a mercenary commander or crossbowman or such like men of blood, and practicing surgery. Historian Brian Todd Carey wrote for the War History Network that such bans reflect a clear and present fear both the nobility and clergy had for missile weapons employed by commoners against their social betters. Hatto argues that the ban must have had the primary motive of maintaining the position of the feudal class, not so much against the peasant, but from the burgher and centralizing monarch and their use of mercenary crossbowmen like the famous Genoese. More recently, in the medieval crossbow, a weapon fit to kill a king, Stuart Ellis Gorman argues the ban is better seen in a continuing effort to ban fighting between Christians in Europe, and it's part of the Peace of God movement, meant to protect peasants from the interscene warfare of the elites, not the other way around. Missile weapons in general had a negative connotation among many in the culture of knightly chivalry. Bertrand du Bar-sur-Aube, a 13th century German poet, wrote, "Cursed be the first man who became an archer. He was afraid and did not dare approach." Despite the bans and negative associations, all European armies of the period made broad use of the crossbow. It was less popular in England, which turned instead to the longbow. The longbows were powerful and generally fired faster and greater range, but required significant training and strength. The crossbow had a shorter range but could be aimed directly at a foe and required less training and strength. The crossbow also notably had the weakness of firing extremely slowly compared to the longbow. They were used more often in sieges, where the static nature of battle gave them some decided advantages, allowing a soldier to load while in safety and only poke his head over a rampart long enough to fire, and conversely for the opponent to wait to fire until the head popped up. In 1215, the Magna Carta included crossbowmen in its provisions, promising that once peace was achieved, we will remove alien knights, crossbowmen, sergeants, and mercenary soldiers. At the 1217 Battle of Lincoln, the monk Roger of Wendover recorded that by means of the crossbowmen, by whose skill the horses of the barons were mown down and killed like pigs, for when the horses fell to the earth slain, their riders were taken as prisoners. Wendover says the royalist army had 250 crossbowmen in its ranks. By the second half of the 12th century, the crossbow was the dominant handled missile weapon in most of Western Europe. Even in England, better known for the longbow, crossbows were so common that an English legal writer during the reign of Henry II wrote of a landowner's obligation to provide a crossbowman for the army. Older, mostly wooden crossbows steadily had more metal pieces added. The 12th century arbalist variation had a bow assembly made entirely of steel, allowing considerably greater power. The most famous crossbow mercenaries of the medieval period were the Genoese crossbowmen, known for carrying large pavese shields to protect them when they reloaded. They came to prominence during the First Crusade, where they fought at the siege of Jerusalem, and they were the deciding factor in the Battle of Jaffa, where Richard Lionheart was heavily outnumbered by Saladin. Thousands of crossbowmen are known to have joined the Fifth and Seventh Crusades. The Hussites in the 15th century made significant use of the weapons. They also play a role in legends, particularly famous in the Swiss story of William Tell, a legendary crossbowman famous for shooting an apple off his son's head and assassinating Albrecht Gessler, a tyrant put in place by the Habsburgs in a Swiss canton. His actions supposedly encouraged open rebellion and the founding of the Swiss Confederacy, dated to around 1307. The Catholic Saint Sebastian, said to be killed by Diocletian's persecution of Christians, has often been depicted shot with crossbows. According to French muster rolls of the 15th century, crossbowmen were especially used in garrison duty. They also saw significant use on ships, where they were used to fire from the deck and protect ships from boarders. In 1241, a law passed in Denmark required all ships to carry a crossbow with 36 bolts. 2 years earlier, Emperor Frederick II ordered all of his ship captains to have 3 good windlass crossbows. And in 1400, the Admiral of France ordered that his men should greet enemy ships with powerful windlass crossbows. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, the French had an estimated 20,000 Genoese crossbowmen, but still lost the battle. Great crossbows, considerably larger and used as siege weapons, were used frequently in the late Middle Ages. Of course, crossbows also famously failed the Genoese at the Battle of Crécy during the 100 Years' War. The exact cause of their failure is debated, but rain might have impacted either the strings or their ability to load, and they may have fought without their pavises. Some accounts say the French knights then cut down the retreating mercenaries. The crossbow was slowly phased out of European armies in the 16th century as advances in firearm technology, and the arquebus, which first appeared in the Ottoman Empire in the preceding century, became the dominant form of missile troop. As loading the weapons became simpler and safer, they proved better than crossbows, easier to aim, better at penetrating armor, and simple to use, and crossbows largely disappeared. By the 1520s, they were essentially gone from European armies, with the exception of Sweden. They seem to have remained in use, however, as hunting weapons and traps, where their simplicity and silence proved more useful. In the late stages, during the 16th century, a small version of the crossbow called the latchet or latch was used by horsemen, especially by the border reivers, raiders along the British-Scottish border. While they were invented by the Chinese first and reached their height in medieval Europe, they were used in many parts of the world. West African cultures and the Inuit both used simple wooden crossbows and may have invented them independently, although they also may have first seen them from contact with Europeans in the case of Africa or across the Bering Strait in the case of the Inuit and other Arctic-dwelling American groups. Donald Ball, a member of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, published a paper in the African Diaspora Archaeology newsletter in 1996, examining how the West African crossbow may have been adopted and used by Native American groups, specifically the Rappahannock and Catawba, brought there by enslaved people. In Appalachia, there is a tradition of using mountain crossbows, or Appalachian crossbows, for hunting from the 19th century, especially as firearms and ammunition could be difficult to purchase, either because of isolation or poverty. Crossbows have continued to see use, although limited in the modern era. They have been used continuously among people of northeast India and parts of Southeast Asia in the modern era. They saw use in China in the Second Opium War. In the First World War, the French and British used a kind of crossbow called a censuram. The word means grasshopper, to throw grenades and bombs from trenches. And at least 2 examples of Belgian hunting crossbows in the collection of the Imperial War Museum seem to have been pressed into service in the trenches by the Germans. There were experiments with crossbows as silent weapons for special service in World War II. The American OSS developed the Little Joe pistol crossbow, although they didn't see use. 2 Australian soldiers fighting in New Guinea developed the Aerospeed crossbow gun as a silent weapon for raiding parties, and it does seem to have seen some use. Even more modern conflicts have also seen the use of crossbows. The people of the Central Highlands of Vietnam, various tribes referred to under the umbrella term Montagnards, were recruited on both sides during the 20-year conflict. The people used a traditional crossbow made of bamboo for hunting, and various accounts claims that they were sometimes used in the fighting. In the book The Crossbow and the Bow in Modern Warfare, Arthur Credlin notes that there was an anonymous report that a Montagnard crossbow disabled the engine of an American helicopter. The emblem of the Air Force's 633rd Air Base Wing includes a crossbow, an homage to relationships developed with the Montagnard during the war. In 1999, The Guardian reported that British-made hunting crossbows were being used by Serbian soldiers in Kosovo, in ambushes and as a counter-sniper weapon. And modern forces might still deploy crossbows in specialized situations, for example, when the use of firearms might cause an explosion hazard.
The crossbow has a surprisingly deep and varied history, from the ancient battlefields of China and the Far East to the medieval battlefields of Europe and even beyond. In their time, they were among the most advanced weapons on the battlefield, fundamentally altered the makeup and strategy of numerous armies, but like the bow and arrow, they've pretty much disappeared from military use, except for maybe a few very specialized functions. Still, they hang on today. They're used for hunting and for sport, and they've even shown up in popular culture. For example, the tactical crossbow used by Daryl Dixon in The Walking Dead. While a crossbow today is something of a novelty, the Devilish invention certainly left its mark on history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.